Before we begin, I want you to do something simple with me. Not symbolic, not dramatic, just human. Take a slow breath and imagine the sound of metal being struck in the dark. Not the clean sound of factory, not the rhythm of progress. This is heavier, slower, a sound that echoes because there is nothing around it to soften the blow. Now hold that sound in your mind, because in the Recôncavo, Bahia, in 1881, iron was not neutral. It never had been. The Recôncavo Baiano wasn't just a place on a map. It was a pressure chamber, a humid bowl of land wrapped around the Bay of All Saints, where sugarcane fields stretched endlessly and wealth traveled one way, upward, while suffering sank deep into the soil. By the 1880s, Brazil was standing on the edge of something it refused a name. Slavery was dying on paper, but very much alive in practice. If you were enslaved in the Recôncavo at that time, freedom existed mostly as a rumor, something people whispered about after midnight, the way you whisper about storms forming beyond the horizon. You could feel it coming, but you didn't know who it would strike. And in the middle of this world lived a man who worked with fire. We don't know his birth name with certainty. History rarely bothers to preserve the names of people who weren't supposed to matter. What we know is what he became. He was a blacksmith. Every plantation needed one. Chains break, shackles bend, tools wear down. And so this man's strong hands, scarred forearms, lungs blackened by smoke, stood every day in front of the forge, feeding fire with one hand and iron with the other. He repaired the instruments of captivity. Or at least, that's what everyone assumed. I want you to place yourself in his position. You spend your life shaping metal that will be locked around someone else's body. You hear the screams when the chains bite too tight. You see ankles bleed. You smell fear mixed with rust and sweat. Day after day. Now ask yourself something honestly. How long before iron stops feeling like iron and starts feeling like a decision? The forge was small. Low ceiling, no windows. The air was always thick, always hot, always tasting of smoke and salt. But it was one of the few places enslaved people could pass through without suspicion. A broken hinge, a cracked collar, a snap lock. Every excuse brought metal to the fire. And slowly, quietly, something changed. Not in speeches, not in meetings. In angles, blades are not born sharp. They are chosen. A hammer can flatten iron into obedience, or stretch it into something else entirely. And this blacksmith understood something most overseers never did. Iron remembers what you asked it to become. At night, after the plantation had gone silent, he stayed behind. Not every night, not enough to raise alarms. Just enough, a fraction shaved here, a curve adjusted there, edges that weren't supposed to exist. What left the forge during the day were chains. What remained after dark were questions. Some say the first blade was meant for nothing more than cutting cane. A tool, nothing else. But tools, like people, change meaning depending on who holds them. Word spread the way dangerous knowledge always does, indirectly. No names, no confirmations, just a feeling. There are knives now. They don't come from the market. They come from fire. By 1881, the Recôncavo was tense. Runaways were increasing. Overseers were nervous. Punishments were becoming harsher, not because control was strong, but because it was slipping. And fear always makes power cruel. Then came the night when the iron finally chose a side. It wasn't a full uprising. Not yet. It was smaller, sharper. A patrol was sent to retrieve a group of fugitives believed to be hiding near a cane processing site. The men were armed, confident, careless. They believed, like most men with authority, that fear alone would carry them home safely. They didn't know the forge had already spoken. The confrontation was brief, messy, close, not the kind of violence you see in paintings or monuments. This was breath against breath, mud, panic, hands slipping on wet handles. When it was over, 2 overseers were dead, and for the first time, the blades were not taken. They were left behind. I want you to think about what that means. Weapons abandoned is not weakness. It's a message. By morning, the Recôncavo felt different. The air was the same. The fields were the same, but everyone could feel it. The invisible line that had been crossed. I had stopped serving quietly, and every master in the region understood one thing with terrifying clarity. The man who made the chains had also learned how to unmake them. Pause for a moment, because what comes next is not just about violence. It's about how power reacts when it realizes the tools it depended on have. By sunrise, the Recôncavo was holding its breath, not in shock and calculation. Plantation owners didn't gather in panic. Panic is for people without options. These men had land, money, and a system designed to bend reality back into shape whenever it threatened to crack. What they felt wasn't fear yet. It was insult. 2 overseers dead meant more than lost lives. It meant authority had been touched openly and left bleeding on the ground. An authority once wounded doesn't ask questions. It demands examples. The first reaction wasn't to look for the fugitives. It was to seal the region. Roads were watched. Ferries across the bay were inspected. Enslaved people were counted and recounted like inventory that might suddenly learn to walk. And then attention turned, slowly but inevitably, toward the forge. The blacksmith didn't run. That detail matters. Men who know they are guilty usually flee. Men who know they are useful tend to stay. He kept working, kept repairing hinges, kept feeding the fire as if nothing had shifted. But the forge was no longer invisible. Masters began showing up unannounced. Overseers lingered longer than necessary. Eyes watched his hands more closely than his face. And still, nothing. No blades were found. No hidden weapons. No witnesses willing to speak. That silence confused them, so they changed tactics. Instead of asking who made the knives, they asked who knew about them, because knowledge in a system like this was always considered contagious. Interrogation started quietly, not public, not formal. A man taken behind a storehouse. A woman questioned while carrying water. A pause in work that lasted just long enough to leave a bruise no one could point to. Who brought you the blade? Who told you where to go? Who taught you to hold it? The answers were always the same. I don't know. I found it. It was already there. Silence became suspicious. Ignorance became rebellion. Within days, punishments escalated. People were whipped not for acts, but for not knowing, or worse, for knowing and refusing to give language to it. And yet, no one named him. Think about that. In a system built entirely on breaking people apart, on isolating pain until it screamed names, the silence was unnatural. That terrified them more than the blades ever had. So they came for the forge, not with soldiers, with paperwork. An accusation was written carefully, almost politely. Negligence, irregular craftsmanship, endangering property. The blacksmith was summoned, not dragged. He walked into the administrative house, which stood still under his nails. Witnesses later said he looked calm, not defiant, not submissive, just finished, like a man who had already crossed whatever line he believed mattered. They questioned him for hours about his tools, about his schedule, about the exact number of items he had repaired in the last 6 months. He answered everything. Truthfully, that was the problem. Truth, when spoken inside a lie, sounded like provocation. When they finally asked him directly, when the room grew quiet enough for the question to feel heavy, his answer was simple. I shape what I'm given. No denial, no confession, just a statement that refused to kneel. They held him anyway, not because they could prove anything, but because holding him felt necessary. Authority needed a body to press against the fear spreading through the region. News of his detention moved faster than the guards expected. By nightfall, enslaved communities across the Recôncavo knew one thing. The fire had been taken. And something else happened. Something no one wrote down. Work slowed, not stopped. Slowed. Tools were misplaced. Cane deliveries arrived late. Locks jammed. Animals wandered where they weren't supposed to. Nothing dramatic. Nothing punishable on its own. But together, it felt like resistance breathing just under the surface. The masters blamed each other. Overseers blamed workers. Workers blamed exhaustion. And in the center of it all, the blacksmith sat in a holding room that smelled of damp wood and old ink, waiting for a judgment that had already been decided in spirit, if not in law. Here's the part history rarely explains properly. This wasn't about whether he made blades. Everyone in that room already knew the answer. This was about whether an enslaved man was allowed to choose what iron became. Because if iron could change its purpose, so could people. And that idea, that was the real crime. The trial was scheduled quickly, quietly, no announcements, no crowds invited, just enough formality to pretend order still existed. Outside, the Recôncavo stayed tense. Inside, power prepared to remind the world who still owned the fire. Take a breath here, because the next step wasn't justice. The trial did not begin with a gavel. There was no dramatic call for silence, no audience shifting in wooden benches, no sense that truth was about to be weighed. It began with doors closing, thick ones, heavy ones, the kind that make a room feel smaller the moment they shut. Inside, the air was formal and stale, paper stacked neatly, ink bottles aligned with care, men seated in places they believed had been waiting for them their entire lives. And standing in front of them, no chains on his wrists, no rope around his waist, was a blacksmith. That detail confused some observers later. Why wasn't he restrained? Because this was never about escape. This was about containment. The charge was read aloud in a voice trained to sound neutral. Complicity in acts of violence, abuse of entrusted labor, endangerment of property, and order. Notice the absence of a word. Murder. They didn't accuse him of killing anyone. That would require evidence, witnesses, facts that could fracture under pressure. Instead, they accused him of possibility, of creating conditions where violence could exist. That kind of accusation is harder to fight because it doesn't ask what you did, it asks what you allowed. When invited to speak, the blacksmith didn't deliver defense. He didn't beg, he didn't explain. He asked a question. If iron breaks a lock, he said calmly, who is responsible, the metal or the hand that turned the key? The room shifted. Judges don't like questions, especially from men. They don't consider full participants in the world of thought. They reminded him of his position, his condition, the generosity of being allowed to speak at all. He listened, and then he said something that never made it into the official record, something too dangerous to preserve. I was taught to obey, he said, but I was never taught to be blind. You can feel it now, can't you? That tightening in the chest, that instinctive recognition of a line being crossed. The verdict came quickly. Guilty, not with a sentence meant to satisfy law, but one designed to disappear him. He was to be transferred, removed from the region, assigned to labor far from the forge, far from tools, far from fire, exile without distance, erasure without death. On paper, it was clean, humane, even a way to restore order without creating a martyr. But something went wrong. The day they came to move him, the forge was already cold. No fire, no tools laid out, no man waiting. At first, they assumed escape. Then they realized something else. No one knew where he was. Not the guards, not the overseers, not the enslaved workers who had shared space with him for years. It was as if he had been lifted out of the story entirely. Searches followed. Questions were asked again, harder this time. Still, no answers. And that's when the story began to change shape. People started saying they'd seen him after the trial. Not clearly, never directly. A silhouette near a cane field at dawn. A forge fire burning where none should exist. Blades appearing, not many. Not enough to start a war, just enough to remind people that disappearance doesn't always mean absence. Masters dismiss these stories as superstition, folklore born from fear and guilt, but they adjusted their behavior anyway. Forging was centralized, metalwork was monitored, fire became regulated, because even power understands symbolism. And the symbol of a man who could not be found, who could not be punished properly, was more unsettling than a public execution ever would have been. Years later, when abolition finally arrived in Brazil, the blacksmith's name was still missing from records. No death certificate, no transfer logs, No final accounting, just a gap, and gaps are where legends live. Some said he escaped by boat across the bay. Others believed he was hidden by Colombo's deep inland. A few claimed he never left at all, that he became something else. Not a man, a warning. I want you to sit with that idea for a moment. History often pretends resistance must be loud to matter. That change only counts if it announces itself. But sometimes, the most powerful disruption is the one that leaves no body behind. The one that forces a system to reorganize itself around an absence it cannot explain. The blacksmith didn't need monuments. He didn't need records. He left something far more dangerous behind. A memory of iron that once refused to stay obedient. And once that memory exists, it never years passed. The sugar still moved. The money still flowed. The plantation still pretended nothing fundamental had changed. But something had. Even before abolition became law in 1888, the Recôncavo was no longer the same place it had been before the forge went cold. Control had become more cautious. Violence, paradoxically, more anxious. Power now moved like someone afraid of the dark, loud, aggressive, but uncertain. And the blacksmith was never officially mentioned again. That silence wasn't accidental. After abolition, Brazil worked quickly to rewrite its own reflection. The narrative became one of generosity, of gradual progress, of freedom granted rather than taken. People like the blacksmith didn't fit. He disrupted the story too cleanly, because his resistance wasn't symbolic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't abstract. It was practical. He didn't write manifestos. He didn't lead marches. He didn't ask permission to be remembered. He simply looked at the same object everyone else saw, iron, and asked a different question. What else could this become? That question is dangerous in any system built on hierarchy. Think about how many systems in the modern world still rely on quiet obedience, on people doing exactly what they were trained to do, never pausing long enough to notice what their labor sustains. The blacksmith story survived not in books, but in behavior. Older metalworkers in Bahia began teaching apprentices differently, not openly, but subtly, how to feel a piece of iron before shaping it, how to recognize when metal was under too much strain, how to respect heat instead of forcing it. These lessons sounded technical. They weren't. They were ethical. Fire, they taught, doesn't just melt metal. It reveals intention. And intention, once revealed, can't be unlearned. By the early 20th century, elders in the Recôncavo would still warn children not with ghosts or monsters, but with something more specific. Respect the forge, they'd say, because fire remembers. No one mentioned his name. They didn't need to. What matters isn't whether every detail of this story can be pinned to a document. Oppressive systems are very good at destroying paperwork, especially paperwork that makes them look fragile. What matters is that something real happened, something that forced power to adapt, something that introduced doubt where certainty had ruled, something that proved even the smallest point of leverage, a hammer, a blade, a choice, can ripple outward. The blacksmith didn't end slavery, but he bent its shape. And sometimes that's how history actually moves, not with a clean break, but with pressure applied in exactly the right place. So let me leave you with this, and I want you to really sit with it. Every system depends on people who believe their role is fixed, that the tools in their hands have only one purpose. That obedience is neutral, but neutrality is a story we tell ourselves to sleep at night. The blacksmith learned something earlier than most. Even chains begin as something else. And the moment someone realizes that the system built on those chains is already cracking, remember that, because fire still exists, iron still exists, and choices, quiet, deliberate choices, are being made every day. The question is no longer what iron was used for. The question is what you do when you realize it can be reshaped,